This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ACER, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, you're probably tired of hearing me say this by now, but here's an important date for your diary. The ACER 2021 conference will be held from the 30th of November to the 2nd of December this year. The conference will be online, which means you'll be able to take part no matter where in the world you are. A call for papers is due out soon, and may even be out by the time this podcast is released. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. I've recently been talking to Agata Marva Montoya, publishing manager at Sydney University Press, and she was telling me all about some of the books that we'll be seeing in the series in 2022. We've got lots to look forward to, and I'll definitely keep you posted. You can get up-to-date news about the series by checking the Sydney University Press website, which also, of course, includes details about all the previous books in the series, which are available to order. Now, I crossed paths with today's guest at a book symposium for Carl Johansson's Wild Animal Ethics, which was hosted by Queen's University. And we've been chatting back and forth since then about a shared interest we have in our relationships with wild animals and the ethics of aiding or interfering with wild animals in various ways. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Gary O'Brien. Gary is a student at the University of Oxford, where he's reading for a DPhil in philosophy. Today, we're going to be talking about his article, Directed Panspermia, Wild Animal Suffering and the Ethics of World Creation, which was published online first in the Journal of Applied Philosophy earlier in 2021. Welcome to the podcast, Gary.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for having me.
So can you start by telling me what inspired you to work on this subject?
I started thinking about this a little more than a year ago when I saw an interview with a German physicist called Claudius Gross. So Gross has written a couple of papers talking about what he calls the Genesis Project. So the idea behind the Genesis Project is that we can send microbial life forms to faraway planets outside the solar system. We choose planets based on certain criteria that physicists understand, which I don't, such as proximity to the sun and that kind of thing. And then if we are lucky, the microbes will take hold on the planet, they will survive, they will start to evolve, and they will eventually, after a few 100 million years, give rise to a biosphere, hopefully as complicated as Earth's biosphere, something full of plants and animals of various kinds. So I saw this interview with Gross, and my first thought was about wild animal suffering. Familiar as I am with the literature on wild animal suffering on Earth, I immediately thought, starting this whole process again on some other planet is a very bad idea, ethically speaking. So I started researching it a little bit more. I stumbled across Michael Mautner, who's chemist, I believe. He's also written on directed panspermia in a positive light. So I started reading the work of these two guys. I spoke with the two of them. They very kindly took the time to speak with me. And I started developing the ideas in this paper.
I see. So what's quite striking there is, when I first read the abstract of this paper, I was thinking, this is a kind of sci-fi possibility. But actually, this is something that people are actively advocating for and working towards. Is that correct?
Yes, it seems that way. It certainly sounds like science fiction, and I won't deny that my unhealthy obsession with science fiction might be partly generative of the interest I have in this topic. But it's a real possibility that at least some people are taking seriously. Gross is a little more pessimistic about it. He thinks maybe this is something we could do in the not too distant future, maybe in about 50 years or so. Mautner is much more optimistic about the whole thing. He thinks we can do it already. He thinks we can seed literally dozens of solar systems with life for a pretty trivial cost. He reckons about $1 billion. He is also much more positive about the ethics of directed panspermia. Gross just kind of seems to think it's something cool that we could do, and that's about as far as his ethical analysis goes. Mautner really has developed a whole system of ethics to do with spreading life beyond the Earth, which he calls panbiotic ethics, the idea of which is to, well, because life is valuable and we think it's good, we ought to spread it as much as we possibly can.
I see. So that's the kind of argument for directed panspermia, but you're actually very worried about it. So could you introduce us to the reasons that you think this is something we should be cautious about or even should reject?
Yeah, well, the reasons we should be very cautious about such a proposal is to do with the level of wild animal suffering that we see on our own planet. So I suppose most people aren't too familiar with this problem. I mean, everyone knows that animals in nature suffer and die. Everyone has seen nature programs where lions jump up on top of zebras and eat them and all that kind of thing. But I think we're very much inclined to underestimate just how prevalent and how bad the suffering on our own planet is. And furthermore, it's not something accidental. It's not that it just happens to be the case that animals on Earth suffer so much. It's predictable. It's caused by a few aspects of natural selection and evolution, which will predictably, in my view, will predictably lead to suffering on any planet on which evolution takes place. So if we understand these factors that are causing suffering here on Earth, we can predict that they would happen on any other planet on which we spread life. And I think it's especially bad to spread life in this fashion, which is without any human oversight, without any human control. Because at least on Earth, we have the possibility, however slim, that we might one day actually intervene to reduce suffering in nature. If we just spread life on other planets where there are no human beings, I think that suffering is just going to go on indefinitely unless some other intelligent life arises on the planet, which is by no means a sure thing.
Yes, I see. So you said that we can attribute the suffering experienced by wild animals on Earth to certain evolutionary factors. What are those factors?
Yeah, so if we look at the causes of suffering on Earth, we can see a lot of causes. We can see predation, parasitism, disease, hunger, and even just simply accidents or bad weather conditions, things like that. I think if we look at these causes a little more carefully, we can see that there are causes that are more abstract and more likely to reoccur on other planets. So the first one is the reproductive strategy, which animals on Earth typically use. Most animals, and by most animals here I mean both most individual animals and most species of animals, most animals on Earth reproduce in very, very large numbers. So we're talking about thousands or even millions of young, most of whom die very shortly after birth. So this reproductive strategy is called selection. The idea is you have very, very large numbers of what are called low quality offspring, just in the hopes that some of them will survive. It's kind of like buying thousands of lottery tickets just in the hopes that one of them might pay off. The problem with selection is that we end up with far, far more animals than the biosphere can support. So, for example, if you think of a sea turtle might lay 1,000 eggs each mating season. But of course, the population of sea turtles doesn't increase by 1,000-fold every generation. We would be nothing but turtles by now if that were the case. What really happens is the vast majority of them die, usually within the first year of life, either by starvation, by predation, and then maybe one will survive to go on to reproduce itself. This reproductive strategy is something that we can reasonably predict will occur on other planets too. The reason for this is that it's in the interests of the DNA to reproduce itself as widely and as much as possible. It doesn't matter that this results in suffering for individual animals because genes aren't interested in what happens to animals' well-being. Genes are interested in spreading as much as they can, and selection, at least on Earth, has been the best way to do that. And I think that's something we can predict will happen on other planets too.
Yes, I see. So do you think there's a particular problem in that if we engage in directed panspermia, we are actively creating the beings who would suffer rather than in the human case on Earth, we're simply encountering beings who are suffering without our hand in their creation?
Yes, I do think that makes things significantly worse. So, as you say, on Earth, we didn't choose any of this. We didn't decide how the biosphere was going to be organized. We just got here. We got to the scene of the crime. We see the animals suffering and dying everywhere. We might have some responsibilities to help them. We might not. I think on balance we probably do, but we can leave that aside for now. In the directed panspermia case, we are deliberately choosing to start this kind of a process on a lifeless world. We're deciding that we want to set things up so that all these future animals will get born, suffer badly, and die. And I think we have very strong moral reasons to avoid doing something like that.
That does make sense to me. Though I am interested in the idea of whether we could reasonably be said to create this sentient life. Because it seems to me, my understanding is that when we're engaging in directed panspermia, if we are sending some tiny microbes, right? Certainly not sentient beings to these other planets. And so if sentient life arises, it's going to be, literally billions of years later.
Probably not billions of years later. This maybe gets a little bit technical, but one of the proposals made by Mautner and Gross is that we send what are called eukaryotic cells. So you're right that these are very simple, usually single-celled organisms. They're certainly not sentient. It'll certainly take a long time for them to evolve into sentient animals. I think it's more in the order of several 100 million years rather than several billion. As far as I understand the process on Earth, the first 2 billion years or so of life on Earth was prokaryotic cells, which are a simpler kind of single-celled organism. It took those 2 billion years to evolve this more complex kind of cell called the eukaryote. And once we had eukaryotic cells, it was a lot quicker to get to multicellular, complicated, sentient animals. But you're right, it's still going to be at least several 100 million years till any sentient beings evolve on the target planet. That said, I don't think that makes a big moral difference to the case. It's if we can predict that this will happen, and if this is what we are trying to make happen, I don't see how the mere passage of time would make us less responsible for that.
Yes, I see what you mean. And I see that maybe temporal distance could be just another kind of distance. So the fact that someone is a long way away from me doesn't mean that I'm not obliged to help them, we might think. And so maybe the fact that someone is a long way away from me in time doesn't mean that I don't have obligations towards them, especially if, as you say, we are creating them.
I was going to say, I think Parfit has a good thought experiment sort of demonstrating this idea. He has this idea of, I think, leaving a time bomb in a kindergarten, but you set the timer for 5 years into the future. None of the children even exist yet. They haven't been born. It's in the future. It's years from now. But you still killed them. You didn't know who you were going to kill. You didn't know who would come into existence and end up in this kindergarten. But the mere fact that it's in the future and they didn't exist at the time of your action, I think does nothing to lessen the sort of moral outrage we feel towards someone who would do something like this.
Now, I wondered if the implications of your argument might go further than simply opposing directed panspermia, and instead speak in favour of actively preventing sentient life from evolving at all. So say we discovered non-sentient life on a planet tomorrow, but we had good reason to think that sentient life might evolve there in a few million years. Do you think that we might have good reason to intervene on the planet and exterminate this non-sentient life to stop it from evolving into sentient life and then creating a whole ecosystem of suffering?
Wow, yeah, that's a good question. I hadn't quite considered it from that angle, but that's very interesting. I would say if we come to discover that there is life that will become sentient on some distant planet, and if we have the capacity to intervene in some way, I think that we ought to intervene in a way that reduces suffering, but I don't think that necessarily means that we ought to prevent that life from becoming sentient. I think the ideal here would be to get to that planet and guide the development of the biosphere in such a way that it doesn't result in so much suffering as has occurred on Earth. Again, this is this is going to involve a lot of knowledge and technology that we currently don't possess and probably won't possess for a long time. That said, I think that would be the ideal solution. If that was not possible, if the choice was simply leave the life alone to evolve on its own course, or stop it in its tracks, stop it from developing into sentient life, that's tricky. I am inclined to say that the answer depends on how sure we are that this will result in suffering and how bad we think the suffering is going to be. But I do think there is a good case to be made for this kind of prophylactic suffering reduction.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it does sound like you agree with the advocates of directed panspermia, or at least in some sense. It sounds like you think that there is some value in there being life and maybe even sentient life. You just worry that the value that exists could be outweighed by the incredible disvalue of suffering.
Yes, absolutely. I'm certainly not an antinatalist or anything like that. I think there would be tremendous positive value in having planets, solar systems, galaxies filled with happy sentient life, or even with complex non-sentient life. I do think there would be some value in having this green, rich universe. I just think the amount of suffering that is involved in a biosphere of our kind, and the likelihood of this arriving, is something we need to take extremely seriously. And I think that this value of that suffering is strong enough a reason to avoid spreading life in this way.
Yes. So maybe you'd be an advocate of directed panspermia if we were certain that it was only going to evolve non-sentient life.
Yeah, if we could be certain that it would not become sentient, or maybe more hypothetically, if we could be sure that this life would become sentient, but that suffering wouldn't prevail somehow. I don't know how we could spread microbial life and have any idea what the resulting biosphere hundreds of million years hence would look like. But if we were able to somehow spread microbial life, knowing that it would result in a generally happy biosphere of sentient life, I think that would be a tremendously good thing to do.
Ah, that's very interesting. That's good. So there's almost there's a middle ground to be found here between the advocates of directed panspermia and, as you say, the kind of antinatalist worries about wild animal suffering, that says, look, it would be good if we could spread life, but just not like that.
Yes, exactly.
I have a final question that's not directly related to the subject of the paper, but I couldn't resist asking.
Okay.
Do you think that there's a chance that life on our planet came about as a result of directed panspermia?
Yeah, that is interesting. I'm not sure if I cited Crick and Ogle in this paper. They were the original proponents of the idea that life might have arisen on Earth in this way. I do find that paper very interesting. They propose this as one plausible explanation of how life might have arisen on Earth, and they've even made it into a sort of a testable hypothesis. So I don't remember the details exactly, but they speculated that if there were, for example, some element, if this element was essential to life on Earth, but it was very rare on Earth, but it was more prevalent elsewhere in the universe, this might give us some indication that perhaps life had arisen somewhere where this element was actually a lot more prevalent. So, it's a testable hypothesis. I'm in no way qualified to answer questions like that. I have no idea.
Do you think it would make an ethical difference if it turned out that life on our planet had come about via directed panspermia?
Well, I think we would have good cause to be quite upset with our negligent parents in that instance. They've started life on this planet, obviously without much care for how it would turn out. Gosh, yeah, I think that would make the situation here on Earth quite a lot worse. It would mean that the suffering obviously is held constant. The suffering isn't more or less because we got here in one way or another. But having someone be responsible for all this suffering, yeah, I think that would make the situation significantly morally worse.
Now, Gary, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I'm ready.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, definitely Animal Liberation. I read this when I was maybe 19 or 20. Yes, it set me off on the path I'm on today, I suppose, in a way. So thank you, Peter Singer. That and then Gary Francione's, a few of his books as well around the same time.
Yes, well, a lot of people answer animal liberation. Singer's a name that comes up again and again.
Yes, I can imagine.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, actually. I suppose it kind of indirectly was a sort of distant ancestor of this piece of work we're discussing. I wrote a paper called Towards a Rawlsian Biosphere. I was trying to argue for intervention to mitigate wild animal suffering here on Earth, and I thought one way of doing that would be to just kind of think of a thought experiment. Well, what would we agree to if we were setting up a planet from scratch, setting up a biosphere, from nothing? But we were designing it from behind a sort of Rawlsian veil of ignorance. We didn't know what position we would end up in the resulting biosphere. And I think this kind of contractualist idea, it maybe just sort of highlights how unfair and how bad the situation is here on our own biosphere. It seems great for us because we are, the winners here. Right? We have very cushy lives compared to every other animal on the planet. So yeah, I just thought about this as a kind of thought experiment. What if we were designing a world? What would be fair principles, involved in designing it? But then this got me thinking, oh, well, this isn't just a thought experiment. What if we actually do one day colonize other planets or spread life in some other fashion? So it kind of indirectly led me to this paper.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think actually I want to say Gary Francione. I sort of disagree with a lot of what he says now, but I found it very convincing at the time when I first read it. And I would say he's more responsible than anyone for me going vegan in the first place and taking a kind of a strong absolutist position on animal rights.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I think it's to keep pushing the sort of moral zeitgeist forward, to keep chipping away at the idea that it's okay to use animals for whatever purpose that we want to and that they're less important than humans. I think just to keep researching, to keep publishing, to keep teaching, and set an example of respect for animals.
Now, this is a fun question for someone who's been thinking about how to redesign biospheres. So, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Assault rifles for chickens. I think, okay, it's a pretty big change, but everyone going vegan immediately, everyone recognizing the moral importance of doing this and becoming vegan. First off, because this would stop all the tremendous suffering that we deliberately inflict on animals. But secondly, I think once you have withdrawn your participation from practices of animal exploitation, it becomes a lot easier to see animals as equals, to see their interests as important. So, it sort of leads to further ethical developments, like recognizing the importance of wild animal suffering, which I think would be quite hard to do if you're eating animals yourself at every meal, for example.
Yes, I see exactly what you mean. So what is it you're working on next?
So I'm working on a couple of papers relating to problems in population ethics as it applies to wild animal suffering intervention. So one in particular is about how the non-identity problem might affect our moral reasons to intervene in nature. In a nutshell, the non-identity problem is a difficulty of explaining how it is that we can harm or benefit beings who only come into existence as a result of our actions. So, for example, it's the classic example of this is Parfit's 14-year-old girl. So this is a girl who's pregnant at 14. She's deciding what to do. And people advise her, look, it would be better for the kid if you had a kid later, he would get a better start in life. He'd be better off. The problem with this is, if she has a kid later, it's a different kid. She can't do anything to benefit the current kid by having a future kid instead. Right, so this is, in a nutshell, what the non-identity problem is about. And I'm working on questions relating to how this affects our reasons to intervene in nature. So if we intervene in nature in a systematic, large-scale way, we're changing the identities of which animals come into existence, which animals get born, essentially. And I'm investigating the question whether this might generate some special moral duties for us, since we are, in one sense, the creators of these animals.
Yes, fascinating. And how can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Facebook, or in academia, or just simply email me. I'm always happy to talk to people about this kind of thing. People can also check out the Animal Ethics website. I do a little bit of work for them. And finally, they could attend the Wild Animal Ethics Conference in St. Andrews this September, where I will be presenting.
And I will be too, so I will see you there.
Yes. Looking forward to it.
Well, thanks so much, Gary, for joining us for this episode of Knowing Animals.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and you can simply find us at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.